Hi, this is Tracker from Polyend. It's a new standalone hardware groovebox based on a grid sequencing workflow first introduced on Amiga computers in 1987. Tracker is digital and sample-based. It has basic wavetable and granular synthesis capabilities, with a few interesting sequencing tricks up its sleeve. In this video, we'll take a look at what it can and can't do, its workflow in detail, let's get started. Let's first explain what's going on with all these numbers scrolling by. The workflow on most other sequencers is one where you sequence events from left to right, either on a piano roll or on a row of steps. Trackers work differently. Here you sequence events from top to bottom, giving you more room to see what happens in every step. The green or turquoise lane contains information about which notes to play in this particular step, so D5, C5, C6, and so on. The yellow lane or column tells Tracker which instrument to play. Each project contains a pool of 48 samples, which can also be used as sources by the Granular and Wavetable synths. This means that every single step can play a different sample if you like, and these steps can also sequence external MIDI gear. If you go below sample number 1 in the pool, you start accessing MIDI channels for controlling external synths. And then you've got two more columns per track, the purple and blue columns, which are called effects lanes. Effects in trackers aren't necessarily effects as you'd probably be used to seeing them with other instruments, but rather more like automation information, like how loud to play a note, panning, micro-timing, ratchets. All in all, about 25 different automation options currently, plus 5 MIDI CC commands and even a program change command. Each effect has a different letter and different effect value associated with it, and if you hit the description button, you can see a detailed description of what each effect does and what its parameter values or ranges are. Just like you can use a different sample or different MIDI instrument for every step in every track, you can also apply a different effect in each of the two lanes. So each of these two lanes can use any one of these dozens of effects. Okay, before I dive into the details of the workflow anymore, let's take an overall look at the hardware. Tracker has a 7-inch color screen. It's not a touch screen. You interact with it using the 8 screen buttons on the bottom here. They each have a function based on whatever is written on top of them. So if I make a change, for example, this is the undo function. This will swap patterns. This one will change the track length, for example. And if you notice, as I turn the jog wheel, you can also make a selection using these pads. So for example, if I wanted to set the pattern to pattern number 5, I'd press here, pattern number 4, pattern number 1, and back to whatever this value was. Aside from selecting parameters, these pads can do a bunch of other things. For example, playing instruments. You can even use them as a keyboard for naming projects or sample names. You saw me use the jog wheel earlier, as well as the different utility keys here. You've got copy, paste, insert, delete, backspace, and so on. Transport controls as well. And then this group of buttons, aside from letting you choose which of the lanes you edit, give you access to all the different screens of Tracker. For example, we're on the pattern screen now. You can go into the sample editor, sample playback options. We'll go over all of these things individually: song mode, mutes and master control, different configuration options. Some of these have dual screens. If they do, you'll see an indication of that over here. So for example, the instrument parameter controls have 2 screens. This is screen 1 of 2, and this is screen 2 of 2. You can store as many projects as you like on the micro SD card. On the back, it comes with a 16 gig card, which is enough for plenty of projects. Each project contains up to 255 different patterns. Each pattern, like I said before, has 8 tracks, which for any given step can play one of up to 48 different samples, which you hold in the sample pool or sequence external gear. Total sample memory per project is around 90 seconds, so don't expect to load or stream full song stems. Samples are converted into mono, but you can pan them in the stereo field. Let's move on with a general tour. Tracker is thin and light with a solid metal enclosure. The pads are silicone and aren't pressure or velocity sensitive, and the buttons are plastic, but they have a pretty good feel to them. Tracker is powered via USB-C. It doesn't have an internal battery, but you can use a 1 ampere phone power brick to power it. You can also send and receive MIDI over USB, but not audio, and they may add an option to transfer files over USB as well. MIDI in and out can also be sent and received over 3.5mm cables like these, TRS cables. Tracker supports the MIDI TRS-B standard, so if you want to work with TRS-A type instruments, you'll need a TRS-A to B converter cable, but for other TRS-B type instruments, a regular 3.5mm headphone cable will work. If you want to work with MIDI instruments that have a 5-pin MIDI input or output, you'll need to use one of these dongles. Tracker comes with them. What you can't see physically is that Tracker also comes with an FM radio built in. I won't play it for you because I don't want to get a copyright strike, but it's pretty cool. It uses the output cable as an antenna and you can sample from it. Just to complete the connectivity picture, Tracker has a 3.5mm stereo output and 2 inputs for sampling, a mic input and line in input. So let's take a look at the workflow from start to finish, from sample to song. You can either import a sample from the SD card using the sample loader, or sample it using the sample recorder. When you start up, your patterns, of course, are empty. And if I go into sample loader, you'll see none of the 48 slots are populated with samples. And you can see I'm not using any of my project memory. You can navigate the SD card using either these arrows or the jog wheel, go into the different folders. So let's say sample packs, and I found out that all of Native Instruments sample packs are 44.1 kilohertz, which is what you need for this, either 16, 24, or 32-bit. Go into the samples, let's say go into drums. And then once Tracker identifies a folder with samples, it'll show you the samples in that folder. You can preview the samples by hitting preview. And yep, once you've found a sample you like, you can add it to the project. And you can also hit add next to quickly add multiple samples into the project. Notice as I browse the samples, this little white bar starts to fill up as I add them to the project. Let's maybe not just add kicks to this one. Let's go maybe into snares. Listen to a few of these. This should do. Anyway, if I browse up and go into maybe the longer samples, let's maybe go into loops here, you'll see that, as I browse through these, they'll take up more space in the project. But it's easy to add them as well. You can also bring in single cycle waveforms and wavetables, more on that later. You can also preview the samples that are already in your project to see what you've loaded up. Delete any ones you don't like. And like I mentioned, there are 48 slots of these, so you can load up quite a few samples into a project within the limits of the memory. Aside from loading up a sample from the SD card, you can also sample audio using the sample recorder. You've got 4 input options: line in, radio, which I will avoid for copyright reasons I mentioned before, and then use the microphone input either with low or high gain. I've got my banged up SingStar mic here, 1, 2, 3. You can apply gain if you like, and monitor on or off, and then record. Testing 1, 2, 3. This is Polyend Tracker. You can crop the sample here or edit it in the sample editor, which I'll show you in a bit. But before that, we need to save it. You can give it a name or have Tracker auto name it. That's not a good name. Okay, that's better. Or you could name it yourself using the keyboard. So in this case, let's say test and 1, 2, 3. I could just save it into the SD card or immediately load it into the project. I can preview it. Testing 1, 2, 3. This is Polyend. Not great, but we'll live with it. Then go into the sample editor and apply a bunch of destructive effects to it. So change the sample itself. For example, amplify it if I wanted to. Definitely increase the gain on this. Process it. Testing 1, 2, 3. This is Polyend Tracker. Preview and apply. And of course, you'll want to use a mic with a pop filter if you're sampling audio. There are a bunch of effects here. I won't go through all of them, but for example, there is even a compressor in here to even out levels. So maybe let's reduce the threshold. I'm doing this on the fly. Let's hope for the best. Reduce attack. Let's see what happens. Process. Testing 1, 2, 3. This is Polyend tracker. Preview and apply. So a little bit flatter there. I can go ahead and, of course, amplify this again. Testing 1, 2, 3. This is Polyend tracker. So I could keep applying these. Let's crush it even more. Why not? Lower the threshold. Process. Testing 1, 2, 3. This is Polyend tracker. Apply. I could process this even more. Obviously, crop the sample if I wanted. Use the jog wheel to set the start and end. And I could zoom in to the sample if I wanted. Like this, for example, apply. There are a few audio effects here. It's a little bit harder to use these because they're not in real time. So I could apply a chorus to it. You know, let's process preview. Testing 1, 2, 3. This is Polyend tracker. Okay, let's not do this. And I could also see how well my sample transposes. Testing, 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 testing. So these are the destructive effects. Destructive means that they actually change the physical sample in the project. They don't, by the way, change the sample on the SD card. So you could always take the original sample, mangle it in other ways in different projects if you want. As you saw, these effects don't work in real time. They process the sample and it takes a few milliseconds or a few seconds, but there are plenty of other real-time effects, the automation effects, a master reverb, as well as different instrument automation parameters, which we'll get to later on. But before that, let's talk about sequencing. Sequencing is done with a pattern editor, and it gives you two views into your pattern. One where you see 4 tracks at a time with all 4 parameter lanes per track, and then another where you can see all 8 tracks, but a single parameter of the 4 parameters at a time, and you get to that by hitting pattern in either node, instrument, and one of the effects lanes. A pattern can be up to 128 steps long. Like I mentioned before, we can use these keys to quickly change values, or just use the jog wheel. Let's maybe go for 8 steps to keep it simple. And you've got 255 patterns. Let's just stick with pattern 1 for now. All the tracks in the pattern are the same length and the same speed, but you can mix and match tracks of different lengths in perform mode, which we'll get to later on. But for now, let's stick with sequencing. So there are 3 ways of getting notes or automation into the grid. You can step edit them, you can play them live, or you can populate multiple steps at a time using the fill function. Let's look at these one by one. The grid won't change unless you hit record. Notice the cursor change from green to red. And just so we see all 4 lanes at a time, we don't need 8 tracks for now. I'll go back to the mode where we see just 4 tracks, but all the parameters. Then entering notes is as simple as selecting the instrument. I've added a few here, but let's just say go for this kick. And then I can punch in the notes. Now we get to one of the important aspects of step sequencing here. When I enter a note, notice how the lane moves down 1 step. That's because step is set to 1. If I wanted this not to move, I'd just set step to 0. And I could punch in different notes. Let's maybe make the length 16. Now you can see how this can come in pretty handy to enter kicks every 4 steps. Just hit 1, 2, 3, 4. And I've got 4 kicks in my pattern. You've got 2 options of viewing the pattern as it plays. If you're in record mode, the grid will stick around the step you're editing. If you exit record mode, the grid will scroll along as trackers tend to do. Now I could put any instrument that I wanted in any one of these steps. I don't necessarily need to use a different track. So let's go into record. Let's say that I wanted to change this instrument to something else. It's as easy as this. Let's say maybe this snare. And there are up to 20 levels of undo, which is obviously very convenient. So naturally, the next step would be to add hi-hats here. How do I fill this up quickly? Well, I could go into step mode and then go up to the top, choose a hi-hat, say this one, and then fill it like this. But that is pretty time consuming. So to do that, I need to first select a range that I want to fill. And if I want to select the entire column, I go all the way to the top, hit Shift and up. I have the entire column selected. I could delete it if I wanted, but let's not do that. Go ahead, select the entire thing and hit Fill. Now here I've got to tell Tracker where I want the note to land and whether it's a note, instrument, or effect. Let's go for instrument, and I want to fill it with instrument number 11. Hit Fill, and I've populated the entire track. If I didn't like that, I wanted to change it, just hit fill again, choose a different instrument, fill, got this. Now, if I felt this was too monotonous and wanted to add a, say, volume effect, right? I'd choose one of the effect lanes, let's say effects 1. I would still want to do this on each step. The effect that I'd want is to change the volume. Here, I want to randomize the values, and you can pick a range for this randomization. Let's just say from here to here, hit fill. If I felt that wasn't enough, I could extend the range, fill. Okay, create a groove like this. So let's maybe add a melodic track. I'll go into the sample loader and let's just browse the samples here. Add this maybe. Why not this one? Each of the tracks, by the way, is monophonic, though you can, if you wanted, add chords to them. So they can play polyphonic notes if you load up chords. Let's add this one. Oh, why not add this and this? Just a little caveat, by the way, I'm testing this pre-launch, so we don't know which samples will come with it. Ultimately, it will come with multiple demo songs, but like I mentioned before, I'm using expansion packs from Native Instruments, which are compatible with this. Anyway, let's go back to my pattern. So let's pick an instrument and maybe just play with it just to get a feel for it. I don't want a chord. Let's okay, let's go with this. So again, I could just enter notes wherever I wanted. I could also use fill for this. So why not, let's say, add a note maybe randomly, so not in each position, but randomly, and go for, let's say, a minor scale, and go from to, let's select these notes. Now, if I hit fill, it wouldn't do much because I didn't select the entire row. Again, fill, and let's go ahead, fill it up with random notes. It's pretty cool. Why not save that? So let's go back to our pattern. We talked about step sequencing. We talked about fill sequencing. The third option is just to play a melody in, either using the grid or an external keyboard. I could do this in a new track, by the way, in parallel to this beautiful bass line. So I could play notes here or using an external keyboard. Maybe go higher. And the nice thing here, if I go into note mode, if you play chords, the notes will spill into the adjacent track. So even though each track is monophonic, you could record polyphonic sequences, you'd just be using up different tracks. Now notice I didn't play this perfectly. Notes aren't quantized when you record, so if we exit this mode, you'll see that Tracker automatically added micro timing for each of these steps. So even though it may look like the notes were added to different steps, and they indeed were, because micro timing is applied, it sounds pretty natural the way I played it. Notice, by the way, that as I recorded, Tracker also inserted note off events. A note will play until it's turned off, and there are a couple of other options. There's also cut, which will cut the note, and fade, which will fade it out. Okay, so as we were doing this, we saw two of the different effect types. We saw micro timing and we saw volume. Let's briefly look at the others. There's panning if you wanted. So yeah, let's say that I wanted to change the panning on these. I could, and it wouldn't need to be for all the steps. So I could just, pan this hi-hat if I wanted, either right or left. And if there are hi-hats, you certainly want roll effects, and there are a bunch of these. So it's as you'd expect. I won't go through all of them. The description here shows you what the options are. You can freeze the video and look at this if you want. So quite a few roll effects here. Anyway, let's sample just a few more effects. There's micro tuning if you like. There are glides, which are cool. So let's maybe go into my bass line and maybe glide into this one. Let's see what happens here. Cool. And as you saw, you can apply these on a per step basis. Randomization of notes, effects values, position, slice, we'll get to that in a bit. Volume and panning, filter LFOs. All these things are things you can automate, as well as MIDI CCs and program change. And you can also insert a break in the pattern, which will end it at that particular spot. Before we move on from the pattern editor, a few other interesting features. You can select a region and invert it if you want it. I don't know what's going to happen now. And obviously undo if you didn't like that. You could copy entire patterns. So if you hit copy, it copies not only the range that you selected, but the entire pattern. Then you can go into the next pattern and hit pattern shift paste. You can copy entire regions if you wanted. So let's maybe copy this entire thing. Why not? Hit copy. Then I could say increase the length to 32. Go ahead into here and hit paste to duplicate it. So now I've got this spread out across a 32-step pattern. You could also copy and paste any range, kind of like Excel, I guess. Let's paste this here, wreak havoc. And again, undo is always useful. If you want to work on a particular range, you can just select that range and hit preview. Again, super useful function I haven't seen, I don't think, anywhere else. And something that isn't available in the beta, but I'm told will come, you'll be able to select a section, let's say this one, which is my chord, or just preview this. And then an option that isn't here, but supposedly will come, will let you take a section and bounce it into a single sample. So you'll be able to do that with a single chord or with entire tracks, downsample them into one track or one sample and add additional layers. I'm sure I'm missing a few of the editing functions. Another nice one is the ability to transpose entire sections. So if you select the section and hit shift, you can transpose it. So now we've got this in pattern 2. And remember, we've got this below. So a lot of handy shortcuts in here. One really interesting automation option is the ability to change tempo mid-pattern. So I'll load one of Ben's, the flashbulbs patterns here. So check out what's going on here. Notice there's tempo automation for these steps. If I hit play, you'll see the tracker stays on this step a little bit longer than the others. So you can change tempo midway if you like as well. So once we've created the patterns that we want for our masterpiece, you can either arrange them into a song in song mode or perform them in perform mode. Let's go through these one by one. So song mode is pretty simple. You just add slots and choose the patterns that you want to play in those slots. So I want, let's say, to start with pattern 1, then move on to pattern 2, and then go back to pattern 1 again. Play will play the current step, and then shift play will play the entire song. And you can also hit play pattern or play song through here. Now, a fun thing you can do here, why don't I just delete these? I've got, say, pattern 1 here, then add a few slots, which I will populate with empty patterns. Let's say 3, 4, you know what, let's put 1 here and 5 here. Excuse the wrong order, but these are currently empty patterns, and this is a full one. Now, I need to make sure that these new patterns are the right length. So I want them to be, then just hit copy, go into pattern 3, paste, pattern 5. Remember, I can select like this, paste. So now they're in the right length. Anyway, I could now go into the grid and then say, copy the hi-hats and put them here, and then copy the kicks and hi-hats, copy, paste them here, and then, yeah, why not add the bass line here as well, copy, paste, and now if I hit play song, now if you go into the actual patterns, you'll see that these were copied in place, right? So these are actual notes that were moved from place to place. So these are quote unquote destructive as opposed to, say, an Ableton Live style grid. So you should be aware of what you're doing here, but this is a really nice function of Tracker. So that's song mode. Another way to interact with your project is perform mode. So there are a few things this lets you do. The first is to select different tracks from different patterns. So let's say I want to bring in my chord, which I think was these tracks from pattern 2. Okay, so I've changed the chord here. I can change it back. And this is quantized, which is nice. I could also mute and unmute tracks with Shift. Just like this, and these mutes are immediate. There are mutes, by the way, in the master section as well, in the second page of the master section, which also includes a solo. But I digress. Let's go back to perform mode. Okay, so mutes and pattern selection. This is when record is off. When you hit record, you can edit this grid. So what is going on with this grid? The idea with this grid is to let you temporarily change one of 12 parameters in any or all of the tracks. You can select 12 parameters from a few more than 12 options. So let's say that I didn't want to mess with volume and I wanted to, maybe add step repeats here. So I could edit step repeats. Let's see how we use this. I'll hit play. You first need to select the pattern that you want to change. So I know my hi-hats are here, and then I can use any one of these buttons and turn the jog wheel to add step repeats. To this track, I could add it to more than one track if I wanted. Say to the kicks for a fill. And then the minute I leave this button, the effect is gone. However, I can set values for each of these 3 rows. This one is always the default row, right up top here. Say we go for, this here, and this, and let's go even crazier here. So now I could use this for fixed performance changes, then I could go ahead and mess with any other parameter, then go back and reset this. Let's maybe try this with one more parameter. Let's go for tuning. So maybe take this 2 semitones down and 7 semitones down and, maybe an octave down and hit play. So this is the default. I could take it down. I'm impacting track 3 here. I could add these if I wanted. Go back to normal, go back to normal. So that is perform mode. I mentioned earlier, you could also mute and solo tracks on the second screen of the master screen. And while we're here, let's take a look at a few of the options here. Just overall project volume. Reverb size, I didn't use the reverb yet, and the reverb in this beta isn't final yet, so I won't be demoing this. You could change the bit depth, go back in time to 12 bits, 8 bits, and even further. And there's a limiter here as well, with attack and release options. Okay, so now that you're a Tracker sequencing pro, let's take a look at the sound design options in Tracker. Let's start with the sample playback options. Now, this is different than the destructive sample editor. Now we're talking about taking the sample and adjusting the way that we play it back. These are the modes that you can choose. Testing 1, 2, 3. This is one shot is Tracker. Pretty simple. Forward loop will let you set loop points. Testing 1, 2, 3. And then loop around those loop points. So let's say set a loop start here and a loop end over here. This is similar to the granular mode, but we'll see that the granular mode has a few extra features. Backward loop is similar, only it will play backwards. Then ping pong, you guessed it, will ping pong between the 2 loop points. Now slice is where things get interesting. You could add slice points manually, so you could just go and add a slice point here and add one, let's say, here, and then here, and once you do that, you could play the slice points with the keys.
Poly tracker.
And you could also go ahead, move between the slice points and remove the ones you don't want. But of course, the nice auto slice feature will do all the work for you. Sometimes it does a good job of detecting the points.
Testing 1, 2, 3. This is Polyend Polyend.
And of course, if you're not happy with the points, you can remove them.
Polyend tracker.
Let's maybe go into this one and remove it.
1, 2, 3. This is Polyend tracker.
Now, currently, the only way to access these slices when you're in the pattern
Polyend tracker.
is to, let's just add a note, and then you could go ahead and enter the slice effect, which is over here, and then choose the slice you want to play.
Testing 1, 2, 3. This is Polyend tracker.
You could also use the randomize effect to randomize the slice point. So that's the slicer. Let's move on. Wavetable is a built-in mini Wavetable synth. Now you could feed it any sample. So I could go ahead and move across the position here, but there's no morphing, so it really wouldn't make sense for regular samples unless this was the effect you were going for, and I'll show you how to modulate this in a bit. But ideally you would load properly formatted wavetables into this, and I happen to have a few of those here. Again, I'm not sure what will come with Tracker. Ultimately, I don't know if these will be bundled or not, but these are nice samples with either a 1024 or 248 sample window. Let's go into 2048, go to an empty slot, and then load up pulse width modulation, why not? So now again, if we go to look at the sample, this is the original sample. It doesn't sound like much because for this instrument, I didn't load up the Wavetable synth. And now, here we go, a nice little pulse. And notice as I go through the position, I can look at the different waves in this wavetable. But of course, it ain't no PWM without any modulation. So we can go into the instrument parameters and go ahead and look for wavetable position, apply an LFO to that, and it's already starting to sound good. Let's go for a triangle wave. Okay, and if we go back to sample playback, we can see our pulse width modulating. I could play this with an external keyboard as well. You can see it does sound pretty good in the lower registers. Now, as you go higher, you will start to hear aliasing. You can sort of hear that a little bit in the background. Potentially, they'll add an anti-aliasing algorithm, but for now, it still works nicely. Let's just take a listen to a few more wavetables just for fun. Let's go with this one. So I'll replace it in here, which means it will be replaced in spot. Let's try a different one. So that's our wavetable synth for the granular synth. Let's open up a project that I prepared here with a few examples. So let's, for example, listen to this sample, which is this. So that's the raw sample. If we go into granular mode, we can travel across the sample. And the elements that you have control over here are position. Pick the point within the wavetable. The grain window length. The longer it is, the smoother it sounds, the shorter, the more granular. The grain window shape. Square is clicky, gloss is smoother, triangle I think sounds the best here. And then the internal grain can either loop in ping pong mode, or forwards, or backwards. I don't think there's a dramatic change here. Maybe if I increase the length, it'll become more evident. Now, most granular synths have more than one grain or more than one grain window moving around, and they have a spray option to move that grain randomly across the sample. But even this with one grain doesn't sound too shabby, and if we pass it through a good reverb, it sounds way better. So I'll just unplug O-Coast here. So this is without the reverb, and if we add reverb onto it, even not too generous, though we could get generous with it. And there are a bunch of algorithms we can try out, but even the most basic ones sound quite special. So I definitely recommend pairing a reverb with Tracker regardless, but especially for the granular modes. Okay, let's move on to talk about instrument parameters. Now, up until now when I was speaking about samples and slots, Tracker has 48 slots, but really what these slots aren't just sample slots, but also instrument slots, meaning you take a core sample and then you can apply modulation and sample playback options to it, which turn it into an instrument, a standalone instrument that can be very different from the sample itself. Now, the instrument parameters have 2 pages. The first is general overall instructions on how to play the sound. So for example, level, which we can always increase, panning. You can also tune the sample, so if it's not tuned to your project, it's easy to tune it either with coarse tuning or fine tuning. And then this lets you also turn on the filter. Let's go for low pass, of course. Tune this down. So that's the filter. Low pass filter. Without resonance, with resonance. You also have reverb send here. Like I mentioned, this isn't the final reverb effect. I'll give you a taste of it, but assume that it's going to change. And then the second instrument page is our little mod matrix. So the idea with modulation is to move parameters around for us automatically. You've got 5 parameters that you can change: the volume of the sample, panning, the cutoff frequency, and wavetable and granular position in the sample. And then the modulation source, or how these parameters will move, can either be off, an envelope, or an LFO, not both together, at least not in the current firmware, so you have to pick one for every one of the parameters. These are the envelope options: ADSR, attack, decay, sustain, release. Attack is the time it takes the envelope to reach maximum level. To the sustain level, add the decay rate or time. And then release is whether the sound will end abruptly or release over time. Now you can replace the amp envelope with an LFO if you like. So this is useful for a rhythmic result, and this is tempo synced. There actually isn't an option for a non-tempo synced LFO, at least not currently. So this is a nice way to generate a rhythmic or pulsing sound. Let's go back to the envelope. Panning is pretty self-explanatory. You can apply either an envelope, again ADSR, or an LFO to that as well. Move right to left. Let's not do this. Cutoff, same thing. Okay, either an envelope or an LFO. So let's, as is customary, check the snappiness of the envelopes. Now for this, I need to maybe turn down the cutoff a lot more and go back into here. Okay. So you get either an ADSR envelope for the filter cutoff or an LFO for the filter cutoff. There's no option to have the filter cutoff track the frequency or the pitch of the keys you play. That would be nice if they could add that. And then finally, for wavetable position and granular position, again, same deal, either an envelope or an LFO. So for wavetable position, you saw that. That's what's been modulating our pulse with. Granular position, again, same thing. You can scan across the sample, which is a nice way of getting a sort of time stretch effect on Tracker. Another feature that I'd like to see added here is a sample and hold or random option for the LFO and slower LFO rates and LFO rates that aren't tied to the tempo. Let's move on to MIDI sequencing. As far as MIDI coming in, you can send in MIDI notes as well as transport and clock. Unfortunately, you can't control instrument parameters or any other parameter with MIDI CC, at least not in the current version of the firmware. Then as far as MIDI going out, you can send out transport and clock. You can choose if you want information coming in going through a USB or through the MIDI jacks or both. And I showed you earlier, you've got MIDI CC, 5 MIDI CCs, 5 MIDI CC channels and program change. You edit the channels in the settings over here. So going into CC outs, you've got control over which CCs A, B, C, D, and E will change. It would be nice in a future firmware update if you could also rename these so that when you went ahead and got into the menu over here, you'd see which parameter you're changing. And then as far as sending MIDI notes, this is our pattern, all currently played by Tracker, but if I wanted this line to be played by No Coast, I would just go ahead and edit the instrument, okay, to MIDI channels. Right now it's open to all the MIDI channels. That was just one note. And you know the drill, if I want to change all of these, select everything, hit fill. The MIDI instruments are instruments 51 to 66. So it's easy to sort of understand what the MIDI channel is. MIDI channel 1 is 51, hit fill, and now we've got No Coast over here. Of course, it always likes reverb. So that's MIDI sequencing, and it works in parallel with whatever's going on here. Before I head out to the pros and cons, I want to answer a few of the questions I received. Can you import mod files? I've been told by Polyend that yes, in a limited way, perhaps maybe just the notes and the samples, but not the effects. That feature wasn't ready at the time of the making of this video. People asked, where's the volume control? Well, there's volume control over here, but there's a shortcut for it. If you hold master and turn the jog wheel, that's your volume control. I was asked whether playback needs to stop when you load projects. The answer is yes. So of course, when you change patterns, that's immediate and instantaneous. But if I go ahead and go into File, click Open, and then let's say I want to go into Light Baths project, which is a beauty. This will stop the pattern. It takes a while. And then you hit play and you're good to go. More of this later, I promise. I was asked whether this can be used as an audio looper or stream samples from the SD card. The answer is currently no. And the answer to the question whether you can export a project as stems, the answer is yes. Either a pattern or a song as stems or the whole thing. I see there's an export to mod option here. I haven't tested this, and that's pretty much it. So let's talk about pros and cons. So the biggest consideration is obviously whether the tracker style grid or spreadsheet interface is something that you'd be interested in using. That's why I showed it in detail in this video, so the decision really is up to you. This is a major shift in workflow compared to anything out there today. Personally, I have to say I found it very intuitive and fast. It didn't take me a long time to learn this at all. It does take a bit to get used to, and I do sometimes find myself missing a button per step workflow, but I have to say that there are quite a few workflow ideas here that make other gear feel very lacking. I mentioned the step and fill options, which are very convenient if you want to step sequence tracks or quickly render patterns. The ability to just select a section and preview just that section, like I said before, is really useful. Same goes for copying information from multiple tracks at a time and putting that anywhere you want. Extremely useful and not available anywhere else to my knowledge. So on the sequencing side, I think Tracker is top notch. Nothing about this feels old or from the 90s. So assuming the workflow is appealing to you, otherwise there's no point in talking about the other features, the question is how does it compare on the other fronts? And there's no easy answer. If you're looking for massive samples per project or streaming audio from the SD card, you won't get that here, at least not in the current firmware. Some Grooveboxes don't have a synth engine at all, so Tracker does better here with the sample, Wavetable, and Granular engines. However, compared to Grooveboxes with dedicated synths, its features are relatively basic. Also, in comparison to some but not all other groove boxes, having only 2 automation lanes is a bit limited, though you do have some wiggle room here because you can change a different automation parameter on a per step basis. So again, depending on your point of view, you could look at this as having multiple automation lanes, but only 2 are available on a per step basis. In terms of audio effects, it would have been nice to have a delay send alongside a reverb. Perhaps that's something that can be added in a firmware update. Of course, the more real-time audio effects, the better. Hopefully, these will be added in the future. If not, be prepared to pair this with something external. On the hardware side, personally, I would have liked to see a few macro knobs for parameter control and obviously an internal battery, though like I mentioned, a strong phone charger can power this as well. So that's my take. Stick around for more sound demos. For more pros and cons and answers to more questions, please feel free to leave a comment below. If you want a whole bunch of ideas on what to do with the synths in Tracker or anywhere else, check out my book, available to the awesome people who support the work done on this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the bell after subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Thanks very much for watching.